Thanks for joining us. My name is Sean Johnson Andrews. I'm your host. I'm the immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association, and I'm broadcasting to you from the north side of Chicago. As always, thank you for joining us in this experiment in scholarly communication, where we chat with activists and academics breaking down the breaking news. My co-host, Rob Carley, is traveling today, so won't be joining us, and we will all take off for the next 2 weeks for the winter break. So I'm really excited today to have some excellent guests for this final episode of the year. Today we're joined by the principal investigators of the Gender Justice and Neoliberal Transformations Working Group, which is a collaboration of 13 scholars working transnationally on questions of gender justice in the contemporary world, which resulted in the co-edited volume Paradoxes of Neoliberalism, Sex, Gender, and the Possibilities of Justice, which has recently been translated into Spanish. At the American Studies Conference in Puerto Rico a few weeks ago, our speakers today joined some of their co-authors in that volume on a panel. And one of the last questions was how their framework and analyses would help explain something like the Epstein scandal, the Epstein case. And they didn't have that much time to answer it. So I thought it would be really interesting to hear more from them. So thanks for joining us today. So we're joined today by Elizabeth Bernstein, who is professor of women's studies and sociology at Barnard College, Columbia University. Her research and teaching focus on the political economy of the body, gender, and sexuality. She is the author of the award-winning books Brokered Subjects, Sex, Trafficking, and the Politics of Freedom, and Temporarily Yours, Intimacy, Authenticity, and the Commerce of Sex. And she's also co-editor of the volume Regulating Sex, the Politics of Intimacy and Identity. So thank you for joining us, Elizabeth.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. Thanks.
Yes. And we're also joined by Janet Jakobsen, who is the Claire Toe Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, also at Barnard College at Columbia University. As director of the Barnard College, the Center for, what is the CR?
The Center for Barnard Center for Research on Women, BCRW.
Okay. She founded the web journal, Scholar and Feminist Online, which I believe you said just had its new issue.
We just published another issue, perhaps even today, either yesterday or today, it came out on abolition feminism, co-edited by Sarah Haley and Emily Thuma.
All right, well, so we'll have to plug that again, put it in the show notes so you can check it out. She's also the author of The Sex Obsession, Perversity and Possibility in American Politics, and Working Alliances and the Politics of Difference, Diversity and Feminist Ethics. With Anne Pellegrini, she co-wrote Love the Sin, Sexual Regulation and the Limits of Religious Tolerance, and co-edited Secularisms. So thanks for joining us, Janet.
I'm happy to be here, and thank you for giving us this chance to, talk through some issues that bring together a lot of different strands of our work.
Well, it does seem like, every day brings a new revelation in what is now regularly referred to as the Epstein scandal. Most recently, we've seen a lot of hand-wringing over the fact that one of the heroes of the left, Noam Chomsky, appears in many of the photos with the wealthy elite men of whom he was supposedly critical, not to mention with Epstein himself, who now stands in for all the salacious implications of this elite's degeneracy. But as I've been talking with the two of you and reading your works, I've come to realize that even the understanding of the Epstein scandal as an object gives it a certain set of discursive constraints advanced by a particular situated and interested parties, few of which have any interest in actually advancing gender justice or liberation. The discourse of why we should care about Jeffrey Epstein and why political actors of all sides appear to think it is an important side of controversy has many of the hallmarks of the broader discourses of sex trafficking and sexuality that both of you have helped unpack over the course of many book projects and chapters. So I was hoping that we could sort of start by each of you saying a bit about your research, both individually and in collaboration, that brings you, or that you bring to a topic like the Epstein case. So maybe Elizabeth,
Yeah,
you can start.
sure. Yeah, happy to start. And thank you for that summation of the conversations we've been having. And I'm looking forward to getting into some of these issues more. So just a very general overview of how I come to this conversation, why it's interesting to me. As you mentioned, when you cited my book titles, I've spent about 20 years writing, researching and writing about sex work, sexual commerce, and globalization, and responses to it that have emerged, including the genesis of this discourse of sex trafficking and how it began to develop in the late 90s and early 2000s as a way, initially, but even into the present, and I can say more about this, responding to some of the forms of sexual violence and other forms of violence that were emerging as sexual commerce was being transformed under conditions of neoliberal globalization and so forth. And let me just say, for starters, that this is one of the things that brought Janet and I together in the Neoliberalism project, thinking about questions of violence, sexual and otherwise, how they emerge under conditions of neoliberalism, how hegemonic responses also emerge, and what other responses might be possible. So this is something that unites my work and Janet's work. Back to the Epstein case, and we can pick apart the threads in a minute. My work was published before this case became as prominent in the media as it has since become, which was really 2019. Brokered Subjects was published in 2018 and is really looking at the emergence of the discourse on sex trafficking and what it does. And one of the things that was interesting to me when I was writing my first book, which was about sexual commerce and globalization in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, that was an ethnographic book. I was looking at sex workers in the United States and Europe and Southeast Asia and their circumstances, and their different kinds of experiences that they had, and which were a range. And some of the concerns they had about making their lives a little easier and their work a little easier and reducing violence in the sex industry and so forth. And one of the things that I was watching in tandem was the emergence of this new discourse on sex trafficking, which in fact comes out of the anti-globalization movement, the battle for Seattle in the 1990s, real concerns amongst feminists and leftists about forms of violence, forms of exploitation that are becoming more prevalent with neoliberal globalization, not just in the sex industry, but in other industries as well, in the agricultural sector, farm work, construction, many different sectors. And I watched as that discourse took shape, became more prevalent nationally, internationally, and transnational organizations, and became almost ubiquitous as a discourse. And as that happened, a number of changes also ensued, and there was a kind of narrowing of what was understood by terms like exploitation and violence, and the emergence of what we call in the Paradoxes of Neoliberalism volume the melodramatic tale, right? And so, yeah, exactly. So,
we definitely have one of those here.
Absolutely. So all of the structural conditions of neoliberalism that were producing precarious situations for many workers, including sex workers, and that activists were trying to call attention to, economic transformations that were happening, conditions of economic precarity, and I can say more about this, how that sort of refracts and reverberates in terms of gendered and sexual cultures and experiences and relations as well. All of that was really being narrowed into a particular kind of tale involving, victims, heroes, and so forth, and clear moral categories that, implicit in my analysis, are really inadequate to understand the structural transformations that, many, many people, including people involved in paid sexual relations, have undergone in the last 3 decades, and not necessarily the most helpful way of addressing these kinds of issues. Right. One other thing I want to say,
yeah, absolutely.
At the outset of this, I think what part of the reason that the Epstein case has captured so much of the nation's attention and many different kinds of people's attention. In some ways, although we've had the trafficking discourse now, since say, the late 1990s, so almost 30 years, in some ways, it's taken 30 years to produce the perfect case that the discourse actually was set up to sort of encapsulate and this is the perfect melodramatic case in a way, because now we not only have a clear set of victims who are more sympathetic than other sets of victims to broader segments of the population, right? So
Right.
they're for reasons that have to do with race and
Totally.
articulation and access and so forth. But also we kind of have a perfect villain right now. And the fact that Epstein is Jewish is not incidental to that fact. If we think about, other moments, other national moments when it was clear that the sort of structural and economic conditions were, had led to great distress for many people. I'm thinking of the 2008 financial crisis. I'm thinking of the mobilizations around Me Too, and now I'm thinking about this. It's always good to have a villain on top. So we had Madoff, we had Bernstein, and now we have Epstein, as if they themselves were the locus of the problem rather than a symptom of larger dynamics. And maybe I'll just pause here for a second in case Janet wants to jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to pick up on a lot of these threads that Elizabeth has been talking about. And, we've had the great pleasure of working together for many years on how these issues come together. I'm a scholar of religion. I'm trained in a program that was called Ethics and Society, and I focus on Christianity and American politics. And that means that I think about the sites in our society where religion and especially Christianity is particularly powerful. And that also means that I think a lot about violence, which is to say this, that one of the places where religion really comes into play is around questions of the family. And as we know, when it comes to the issues that are associated with the Epstein case, which are about sexual violence, at least to some extent, the family is in fact the predominant site of this type of violence in our society. And that's one of the things that the idea of it as a scandal or a melodramatic narrative, as Elizabeth was saying, gets pushed to the side. And the ways in which, and this is what the book I did with Anne Pellegrini called Love the Sin was about, the ways in which what is called Christian family values reinforce a familial structure that in fact is the site of is the primary site, is not primarily sexual violence, but it is the primary site in our society of sexual violence, just disappears. It just disappears. And the other thing that I think about is in this melodramatic narrative, the hero is often the state, and it's the punitive state in particular ways. And as we also know, and it's become especially obvious again, although, historically there's a lot of points at which this comes to the fore, the nation state itself, especially in the United States, is organized around Christianity and what could be called white Christian nationalism. So there is both a movement associated with white Christian nationalism that hooks into a set of understandings about how the nation state is formed around ideas of gender and sexuality and their morality, for example, and that this punitive state, which is supposed to save us from sexual violence, actually enacts all kinds of forms of violence through its own policing or through militarization, and also reinforces the patriarchal aspects of the system that Elizabeth is talking about. So, that's where our work comes together, Elizabeth as a sociologist of political economy and mine as a scholar of religion in relation to political economy.
So in our conversations over the past few days, both of you have said something like, and I think Jenna, this is a quote from you, but it's something that both of you have kind of said, that there are things to be learned from these files, but it is not the things that people think that they are learning. What do you think is important about this story that our culture is telling about Jeffrey Epstein, and what is the focus that we currently have? What is that hiding?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start, Elizabeth, because I do think that one of the ways we've been talking about the Epstein case, because it's coming to the fore now for reasons that Elizabeth laid out in the beginning, but it's really operative in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, meaning the development of the neoliberal period. And insofar as our work on neoliberalism is about the ways in which the neoliberal period is the on-ramp to the oligarchic capitalism that we find ourselves in currently, this case, and especially the emails that have come out more recently, is a great way to try to understand that as a political social formation. Gender and sexuality, our argument is that gender and sexuality are central to these political formations. And so the ways in which powerful men casually talk to each other about sex, about their sexual relations, often as powerful married men who have sex outside of those marriages, which is the structure of, in fact, a certain form of American family values. Understanding that and understanding how that subtends then a move toward individuals of immense wealth also having immense power over our lives could be really helpful. It also could be helpful in looking at the system that enables, and therefore, if analyzed, could help us to prevent sexual violence. So the two things come together, which is to say, we get a different analysis of political economy and what it's about. It's not a partisan issue between Democrats and Republicans. It is about a certain class formation that is also a social formation. And that social formation is also about gender and sexuality and the power dynamics within that.
Yeah, and we see a lot of that in those emails.
Yeah.
And if we focused on that sort of formation, it would be interesting. Yeah, sorry, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, just a small addendum to what Janet said, and agreeing with all of that, and just adding just one more wrinkle. I think one thing then that we can learn, if we watch this, one more level of this, if we come to it as cultural studies scholars, as theorists, is watching all of that complexity that Janet just pointed to, then to do our own ethnography of a discourse with the Epstein case in a way, to watch how that then gets packaged, folded, and assembled as a media story. So we can also sort of, at that level, it's also quite interesting to me. And it seems to me that there are two media narratives and two sets of concerns, right? There's, the biggest one, is the sex scandal piece, right? It has this, how, all of this complexity and all of what's interesting. And I think interesting to many listeners, viewers, people who are following these stories, even if they're not pointing to all of the elements, but then watching how all of that gets compressed into a story about that's reduced to, sexual predation and who was there and was Trump in the files and, who are the bad men and identifying bad actors. So watching that reduction take place again, there's an object lesson there about how this happens over and over again in different historical moments, as I mentioned. And also then alternatively, there's a sort of a minor note of a more minor thread of other journalistic commentary now. And, for example, you pointed to the example of Chomsky in your opening remarks. I mean, and that sort of, that sort of crosses both, was he there or not? What's he doing there? But also, in certain left sectors, there is a little bit of interest in, in this as a sort of window into oligarchic relations, but then again, sort of pushing the sex stuff aside. So one of the things that I think Janet and I, try and do in our work and in the analysis that we would bring to a case like this would be to think about how the pieces go together, right? And some other way, a story that could potentially be told that isn't being told, and conversely, what's at stake in the way that the story is being told, and I think we would both argue that that the conventional ways of narrating this or framing it, while perhaps their aspiration, at least of some actors, is liberatory, is ultimately conservative and eclipses possibilities for meaningful social justice and feminist intervention rather than opening them up. Right.
Well, and to some of the points that you raised in your book, there is a real carceral feminist sort of framing here, right? The reason to kind of identify which are the individuals who have done this bad thing is about it's only individuals that have done the bad thing, and the way to sort of solve this problem is to punish them in some way.
That's exactly right. And so one of the reasons that it became interesting to me to trace the genealogy of the trafficking discourse is because, and this is why it's not even my favorite way of referring to things like this, although I think the violence was quite real, or can be. Trafficking discourse from its inception was a criminal justice discourse. So the UN Protocol on Trafficking in Persons that was issued in the year 2000, it was a criminal justice protocol. It was a crime control protocol, right? So when you use the language of trafficking, you're already in the criminal justice framework, right? And so that means you're already, as you suggested, looking for victims, you're looking for perpetrators, you're imagining these as individualized phenomena, and you're not looking at systems, and you're not looking at the social conditions that produce situations like this, right? So, if we're resorting to criminal justice, and I can understand why people who may have suffered at the hands of people like Epstein might want to do that, there are limits to how much change you can effect. You can put one bad person in jail, but can you change the system? No, I don't think so.
Well, and just to follow up on the discursive element, one of the things that is not mentioned in the mainstream press at all is there has been, over the time that Elizabeth studies, growth in what is a really significant movement for transformative justice. And the whole idea is, and this is a movement of survivors of violence as well as advocates of different political commitments. The idea is that, well, let's prevent this in the first place. Let's not just respond. And the way to do that is to transform a society that makes this overdetermined. Mm-hmm. And the overdetermined is one of the things about the way the discourse plays out that Elizabeth points out for us is the overdetermination. We're making it greater through the retelling of this same story over and over and over again. And so to tell this story without even mentioning transformative justice as a possibility is, to my mind, I was thinking this morning when getting prepared for this, you have real anger at whatever violence may come up, but then just the tragedy of it, to be talking about this in so many venues again, without talking about what are the actual transformative possibilities. That this could be a moment when we could be talking about all kinds of very different things that could really help people's lives.
Yeah, I think there is also, though, because it's this oligarchic capitalist formation, the sort of desire for guillotines is strong. So to kind of go to this sex trafficking discourse, because I think that's part of the kind of underlying. That's kind of part of what seeded this. In your book, Brokered Subjects, Elizabeth, I was really struck by the fact you kind of lay this out. There really isn't a large-scale phenomenon statistically of this trafficking anywhere, right? And you spoke to many of the people who've advanced this. I mean, just in terms of like you said, like in all of. I don't know that you'll have to this the stats better than I do, but
yeah,
it was sort of like in all of New York over like a 20-year period, there are like 26 people that were arrested or something like this. It's supposed to be the global center of this, and 26 people. But you've spoken with a lot of the people who've advanced this discourse and the institutions that have profited from it. Is this like just a really big grift, or do they believe it? What's going on here?
So a couple of things. So I think, again, I in some cases it's grift, but I think many people are well-intentioned and believe it. And part of the reason you believe it is, again, to sort of come back to the way this discourse emerged and then transformed over the years. That's we need to keep that in mind, right? So sex trafficking, it's a relatively recent category, right? It only goes back to 1998 or the year 2000, depending on when you want to start counting. I mean, there were other discourses that preceded it. There was a white slavery panic in this country 100 years ago, and it sort of picks up on some of that. So, but this language of sex trafficking, right, as a criminal justice category, and as one that we have all, in the subsequent years between 2000 and 2025 that we've all come to internalize and naturalize, right? It's relatively new. And in that interval, a couple of things happen. It gets redefined in several different ways. So when the category emerges, the number that's put forth is that there's 50,000 victims, right, a year, which curiously was also the number that was put forth 100 years ago when people were talking about white slavery. So, nobody had a way of counting. That just sounds like a big number. And so we use that, right? And but it was defined only as cross-border trafficking. So, so some of the things that now we might think of would qualify as sex trafficking were not part of the definition. So the imagination of this, and again, because the category emerges out of activism around anti-globalization, it's about global sex workers, right? When it emerges. So, the paradigmatic case, and there's, then this comes into television specials and magazine articles, is the young woman trafficked from Eastern Europe or from Thailand to the United States and so forth. Very soon, after that definition is put forth and the 50,000 women a year, a number is put forth by the CIA, right? It becomes clear that nobody can identify that number of victims, right? I mean, that it was a dramatic number that they came up with, and there was precedent for using that number. And the definition then widens in 2005, and activists say, well, let's also talk about domestic sex trafficking, right? So anybody underage, anybody who's trafficked across state lines, let's open up the category, right? So things that had previously might have been adjudicated as underage sex work or underage prostitution, or just violence and exploitation, pimping, pandering, and so forth, are now folded into this category. So the category is a living thing, right? And it's a political thing. Yeah, and it morphs depending on activist pressure, government interests, and so forth. And one of the interesting and curious things to me right now is Donald Trump has actually gutted, after all these years, the Trafficking in Persons Office, while at the same time we have, as I said in the beginning, in some sense, now we actually have the perfect paradigmatic case of trafficking, that the category, the category comes first, and then, the material instance, in this case, I think, comes second. Like, this is the case that the category always needed to resonate publicly, and that's why it is. So, do I think activists have bad intentions? No, not necessarily. But do I think that there is a trap in using this framework to describe the myriad forms of exploitation and violence that many people undergo, in and out of the sex industry? Yes, I do think there is a trap. So I don't think this is the best path forward, and I think when you're stuck in it, then you get into these embarrassing situations where you have to find, like, if you're making the case on the numbers aren't there. What the Epstein case brings us is, at the level of affect and imagery and moral outrage, it's a perfect case. Right.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, just to follow up on that, I just want to point out that it's not surprising, again, historically, that something that has very little basis in empirical reality, in fact, drives our political discourse, and that's crucially important. That the whole, one of the things about the sex obsession is that there's not a specific sex obsession. It is rather the national discourse.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that there is a commitment at a political level and in the form of law and policy, of which the trafficking legislation is just one aspect of it. A commitment to a national sexuality that has very little to do with anyone's sexuality per se. Which is about a monogamous nuclear family that, only existed in one historical moment shortly after the post-war thing, if you take that seriously. And the monogamy part of it is deeply questionable empirically, et cetera. And the people who purvey it are often the least committed to whatever this is, but they remain deeply committed to it at the national level. So, again, during the time Elizabeth is talking about, there would be surveys of what are called red states and blue states about various forms of trying to track sexual practice, commercial sex or other types of things that were countable. And it was pretty much the same in all states. But there was a real difference in legislative commitment between the red states and the blue states. And that difference then turns around because of carceral feminism, because of the punitive state, to actually affect people's lives in very negative ways, not in saving them from violence ways, but in fact, enacting violence on the lives of people who are targeted. But it rarely is connected to the things that would make people's lives better or that actually have to do with their lives. So this is, again, an example of something that happens in other arenas about sexuality as well.
Yeah, this sort of makes me recall, Elizabeth, you also spoke with many of the women who are engaged in prostitution or who might be kind of folded into that, being so-called victims of sex trafficking. Do they see themselves reflected in this discourse, and what is their kind of reaction to it?
Yeah, so as with any labor sector, there's going to be a range of
Sure.
experiences and and opinions about the best way to make things better. But I will say this, that the sex worker organizers, of which there's many, and there's been an important and interesting sex workers' rights movement in this country, really since the 70s, and it's ebbed and flowed and so forth, but also internationally and globally, right? So, sex workers' rights organizers that I spent a lot of time with in this country, in Europe and Southeast Asia, also. I mean, in general, do not like the discourse because for a couple of reasons, right? So, it does nothing to secure their lives as sex workers. So coming back to the melodrama, right? If we think about the victim and the hero and the components of the melodramatic narrative, right? If your only option is to be a victim, a couple of things: you need to be a good victim, right? So that's a racially demarcated category. It means that you need to be recognized as morally pure in a way that will make you sympathetic. So already being a sex worker means you don't make a good victim, right?
Right.
So the better victims are people who can say, I was dragged into this kicking and screaming, not maybe like it was better than working 3 jobs at Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks or cleaning toilets, right? So that doesn't, somebody who says that won't be a good victim, for example, right? It does nothing to secure labor rights for people in the industry, right? And it does nothing to address, other kinds of violence and exploitation that they might be experiencing. So I would say you were asking about the 50,000, et cetera, the numbers that were, like there are really, terrible issues of exploitation in the, in the various components of the sex sector that people undergo and they would like to be able to address, but this framework doesn't get at them. So you agree to work under one set of conditions and then you find a completely different set. And part of this has to do with the fact that this is an illicit labor sector, right? And sex work is not recognized as work, and so you have no recourse other than the victim-villain narrative. That's the only recourse that is available, and that's the only way to garner any kind of sympathy, right, for any kind of violence, sexual or otherwise, that you might experience, let alone questions like labor rights and empowerment and control over your working conditions, et cetera. And I might add, being protected from the violence of police, which is probably the most significant form of violence that sex workers suffer, right?
Because it's an illicit field.
Exactly. Yeah.
But and now we have something like 1,000 victims in the Epstein trial, and so we have this concern that's been activated over them, which I think it kind of really is a good example of what you call conjoining affective commitments to liberation with contemporary techniques of power.
Yeah.
And it just sort of makes me wonder, is the only sort of position for these women the position of the victim? Is the discourse of victimhood necessary to be seen as sort of like an agent or having, worthy of having power? Is that part of it?
Well, I think it's part of it from within the terms of this discourse. Again, in my ideal world, there would be, other possibilities. And this is why, some people, even who are trying to work within this discourse, have, will call themselves survivors and not victims, right? So that's sort of, one little step to reframe that. It's 1,000 women over many years, and that's not a small number. But so again, it always depends. What I like to say in these kinds of conversations is it depends on what the it is that we're talking about. What's the it? Is the it, illicit sex? Is the it sexual violence? Is the it gendered violence more broadly? Is the it, a sort of an intertwined tangle of gendered, racialized, and economic exploitation, depending on how we define the it, right? Then we go from there in terms of we think of how, how can we talk about the harms that have happened? How can we organize around them? And what are we asking for, right? And so, there's also an interesting paradox in this discourse. On the one hand, it's supposed to be sex trafficking is supposed to be so pervasive, and this is why in theory, resonates with so many people. On the other hand, it's supposed to be something we can address by arresting individual men, right? It's got to be one or the other, right? So if it's that pervasive, then then putting particular bad men in prison is not going to be enough, right? It's not, you can't arrest them all. So here's a little thought experiment. If you think about this terrible moment we're in, some people could fantasize about putting any of the oligarchs who we might think of nationally, in jail. Is that going to fix it? No, it's not enough, right? There's more that we need to do, right?
Well, and there's other things that we need to do, and this is just to go to one thing about thinking about what options people have in response to sexual violence. Well, what are you told to do? Go to a lawyer, get a lawyer, hold a press conference, tell your story in a particular way, in the melodramatic way. And one of the things, again, about the sadness of not talking about, for example, transformative justice in this a moment in this situation is that means that is the only thing that is on offer if you are trying to respond to something that you've experienced in your own life. And what could be happening instead is that not only could we be having a broader conversation at a social or national level, but we could also be offering all kinds of other things to people who are responding to the situations of their own life. There's a group in New York called Saki for South Asian Women that was formed to address forms of violence in the South Asian community. And what are they focused on? Prosecution? No, because in fact they are a community, especially after 9/11, that there was more than enough police focus on, right? They're focused on economic empowerment. They're focused on other forms of housing. Housing becomes crucially important. There's all kinds of things we could be working on and could be offering to people as advocates against violence, right? If you form an anti-violence movement, it doesn't mean that your main focus is, to find again victims and villains. But the thinking at this diagonal way, and people not only need jobs, they need housing. That's just not the usual way that people talk about this.
Yeah, I think one of the questions you asked is what is the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah.
What is the problem? Are we interested in solving a broader problem or just this one problem? And then it gets siloed into these conversations about, well, this is just about sex trafficking.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, one of the things that is truly tragic is not only does the siloing remove solutions or focus on solutions in only one narrow area, but it guarantees that even in that narrow area, the problem is not going to be, quote, solved. In other words, the telling of the story is about the telling of the story. And it's about doing so over and over again in order to proclaim your opposition to sexual violence, even as you allow it to go on. I mean, one of the things that is, again, instructive about the Epstein case is the number of people who were fully aware of who Epstein was and with whom it was in some way fine. Or even if they weren't fully aware of who it was, they were willing to help him in whatever dealings he was engaged in. And this ranges from large banks, right, to powerful individuals, to people who just found it interesting to go to his house for dinner. And so thinking about what that means in terms of how we could change things. Are all these people pro, sexual violence? No, many of them are the very people who are against it. And so it's that sense, I don't know, Elizabeth, maybe you can tell me, but I'm sure that JP Morgan Chase has had some anti-trafficking thing, and it's right?
Yeah, it must have. I mean, they didn't have this, as splashy a campaign as some of the other, multinational corporations like Manpower Incorporated.
Exactly.
But
yes,
but
Manpower
for sure.
Incorporated.
Yeah.
Yes, there you go. So if
exactly.
JP Morgan Chase has not done it, I did not have an anti-trafficking campaign. I'm sorry, but many of these corporations, when they were having anti-trafficking campaigns, were also participating in this very culture at the same time.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to unravel there, but one of the things that sort of stands out to me is one of the things you talk about in your book, Sex Obsession, is the way that sexual conservatism is often displayed performatively as a way of showing one's commitment to religiosity, right? So this sort of script is only possible because religiosity is understood as Christian and conservative. But you say that this set of scripts goes back decades and if not centuries. So I'm kind of curious, has the Trump administration and its cultural apparatus weaponize this script in a new way, or is it just kind of par for the course? And is that also, is this script part of what is leading to the Epstein scandal or Epstein case being kind of, I don't know, central to some elements in the culture?
Yeah, no, these are all really good questions, and Elizabeth and I often are in discussion about, is it new? Is it different? Are we doing the same thing again? This is one of our ongoing conversations. And so, I think there are a couple of things to say that are really important. One, and this is where my work with Anne Pellegrini and many collaborators, again, it was a transnational project on secularism, was so important, which is that in a society that understands itself as a secularized nation state, that nonetheless has a Christian history. And there is contention about that now, where people are claiming that it should be a Christian nation state explicitly. But even in the secularized version with this Christian history, where do we find religion? And that's where gender and sexuality and religion seem to come together so profoundly. So in the book, for example, I talk about the Pope puts out an encyclical about the environment, and it's ignored completely. Or he should stick to religion. If he says something about gender and sexuality, then this is the heart of religious commitment. And so that conflation has a lot of effect on why gender and sexuality plays the role that it does. And the second thing is the idea of what conservatism is and what it does. So the presumption is that sexual conservatism prevents sexual violence, and that the problems, whenever problems happen around some kind of sexual violence that become this type of scandal, that the answer should be to become more conservative, when in fact our analysis is that certain forms of sexual conservatism that are related to patriarchal power are in fact the source, not the response or the protection against. And there's now plenty of sociological evidence to show that things that are associated with sexual liberalism, which would be sex education, which would be access to various forms of contraception, et cetera, that these things help to prevent sexual violence and what some of our colleagues call promote sexual citizenship, the idea that you can have agency in your own life around your sexuality. And that in fact might be better at preventing violence than sexual conservatism. So that presumption also is incredibly important. And then the what you could call the structure of the open secret, which is in the United States around both race and sex together, in the creation of political power, is really crucial, which is we have long been committed to the idea that people in power should promote this national conservative sexual agenda, and whether they follow it or not does not matter. So, this round of family values was ushered in fact, by Ronald Reagan, who was the first president to have been a divorced person, right? And that sense that he could be the promoter, and he rarely went to church. He was not a deep Christian, that he rarely went to church, and could be the face of family values, tells us something that, again, as an on-ramp to Trump, we now see in a different way, where Trump himself is his record is well known, and the idea that something is going to be revealed about Trump that we don't already know in the Epstein files tells you how deep the discursive aspect of this is. Sure. We know all this already. We know about Trump's sexual violence, and it's been discussed in the courts of law at that level of evidence. And so that tells us something about the disjunction between discursive commitment and how that plays out in certain forms of politics, and how it does not have to play out in terms of a commitment to actually ending the things that we supposedly, that the nation as a whole is supposedly against. That is not what this politics is about. So it's not that it's not politics, and it's not that it's mere hypocrisy, but it is that it is a politics that is able to proclaim one thing, and through that proclamation carry out a material program that is not akin to what is actually proclaimed.
In your book, I think you call this productive incoherence.
Yes, exactly.
And so is that what we have here? Is another iteration of that kind of
yes, and what the reason it's productively incoherent, the productive part of the incoherence is precisely that we can maintain and use we can build the carceral state, not just maintain, we can build the carceral state through racialized sexual politics at the same time that powerful, mostly white, and certainly in our current situation, almost all wealthy men can live out very different lives, right? And so they get to have, the whole package together. And then for Trump, what he has, been able to do is he then just moves amongst these different positions, and he's able to not be held through his rhetorical gestures accountable for any of it. So, his claims that he has sexually assaulted women, in the Access Hollywood tape, that's just locker room talk. Now he's at work at the time. He's not in a locker room, right? But it's just brushed off as, sex is nothing. And then on the other side, sex is the most important thing that could ever happen. Sexual violence is the worst thing that could happen to someone. And that going back and forth, Lauren Berlant and Lisa Dugan, argue that sex is both overvalued and undervalued. We both push it to the side. It's not important. And as Elizabeth mentioned, this also happens on the left, where it's like, if we're going to also talk about political economy, that means sex must be pushed aside as opposed to holding these things together. It's undervalued on both the right and the left. Brett Kavanaugh, oh, this is just, boys will be boys kind of stuff. And at the same time, it's overvalued. And so any sexual accusation is taken as, oh, how dare you accuse him of this thing,
Right.
Et cetera. And that going back and forth between the undervaluing and the overvaluing of sexuality is part of what holds the whole thing together, even though if you keep the two things in mind at once, you can see the incoherence.
So, and just one little additional point, just to add just one more element of nuance. I mean, I think one of the things that's being produced within the domain of productive incoherence is particular focal points of attention, right? Mm-hmm. So focus here and not there, and by producing those points of attention where we're supposed to pay attention, to this but not that, right? Other things are allowed to flourish, and that is a key way that power is maintained, right? Right.
And just to follow up on that one more time, which is, what I call mobility for stasis, which is to move back and forth between focal points. Right now it's political economy, right now it's sex, but never hold them together. That moving around means that you only see them in this siloed way. You don't see the incoherence of the undertaking as a whole, which means you don't have an analysis of the actual power relations. So in any instance, there's a default on behalf of power. So if you're looking at sexual violence, suddenly the carceral state looks really good and people are into it, right? And these could well be the well-intentioned activists that Elizabeth is talking about, who are not thinking, I will extend the violence of the state. That's not what their main thing is, but only by not holding together the ways in which the violence of the state, what we'll call racial capitalism, and discourses about gender and sexuality come together. If you don't hold those things together, then it's very easy to focus on one and extend the power of a different related or interlocked discourse. So that movement of attention, where you focus on only one thing and then you move to another thing, in fact holds together the stasis of social power.
So as we're wrapping up, I want to make sure we get to this bigger picture that you're both sort of hinting at here. So one of the first comments, or one of the comments you made yesterday when we were chatting, Janet, was that the real scandal is neoliberalism. So I wonder if you could kind of just, if you can give us a quick, what does that mean? And especially, how do you see this connection between the supposedly distinct registers of morality and materiality in that configuration?
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. And one of the things I'm going to turn to is we write about neoliberalism as beginning in the 70s. It's a global project, and so we think, for example, of the case of Chile as an early instantiation of this, and a move then to in the U.S. The 1980s with Reagan, and then the 1990s with Clinton. Sort of intensifications of it. But if we think of a turn that starts to happen in the 70s, that's also a turn away from the types of social movements that offer these other alternatives, that the ways in which movements for racial justice, movements for, gay liberation, movements for feminism, all of these are turned into the neoliberal versions of what they might have become. And, again, this is a lot of what Elizabeth's work, I think, really shows us, is the ways in which movements that began as opening up social spaces get narrowed into reinforcing the state. So, one of the things that I also look at is how did, a gay liberation movement that understood itself as a gay liberation fund that was part of a global anti-colonial struggle become the right to freedom to marry by being regulated by the state. Like, this was a huge shift. And that neoliberalism enabled a political economic formation that both furthered that shift and was furthered by that shift in part through a focus on a form of individualism in which the social began to disappear. And of course, the synecdoche of this is Thatcher's "there is no such thing as society" idea. And so that we have only these individuals. And so what Elizabeth was saying about the idea that therefore we're looking for individual men who are these villains, as opposed to thinking about the social ways in which we might prevent various forms of violence and exploitation. So that's just one, since I know we're short on time, of the ways in which neoliberalism is the scandal, because the social possibilities of those earlier movements are pushed aside all the time. Even as they go on, transformative justice is a development of those movements, but they just are made to be both to be invisible, and there's all kinds of social focus and social power that moves toward the neoliberal responses to these problems. And they're responses, they're not solutions, right? And that's the crucial thing, that neoliberal responses act as though they are solutions. They claim to be solutions, but in people's lives, they rarely are. And in fact, we find that this is so because over the course of this time, not only has it become harder, to get housing if what you need to do is move out of a situation in which there is some kind of violence in the familial situation, housing becomes an issue, but it's harder for everybody to get housing. And so that sense of the ways in which neoliberalism does just make everyone's life harder, and we're now living in this very intensified oligarchic period thereof. So that would be
all the solutions are you're held responsible individually for any of those shortcomings as well. Well, Elizabeth, do you have anything else we should be doing to advance gender justice in this hopefully late neoliberal moment? I think that's.
Hopefully and not hopefully, because I think we're also giving way to something even worse potentially. But I take the sense in which you utter that, and I'll observe that spirit. Yeah. So indeed, as Janet said, I mean, I think one of the things that we have to do is put back together the pieces that have been siloed, and so undo some of the just to make a long story short, I mean, the neoliberalism is the real scandal, both because of what it accomplished in its heyday that Janet just laid out for us, and because it has been the on-ramp to oligarchy that we've been talking about, and and the way that on-ramp was constituted was precisely through this siloing of issues, right? And so I don't want to sound like just one of those nostalgic people. It's like we have to go back to, I don't think we can go back, right? But I think we can learn from the lessons of what happened, and see how in retrospect at least, see the dangers of disarticulating sex from political economy, and then disarticulating sex from social structure more generally. And I'll just say this, that sometimes in debates around sexual politics and sexual justice, for many years, for many decades, we're about to do a conference at Barnard on the 50 years of the scholar and feminist online, and the BCRW, and sex wars and so forth. It was often it's over that whole period. Sometimes people imagine, well, there's a radical feminist perspective that, takes sexual violence seriously and is willing to use the carceral state. And then there's, other people who are, who don't take violence seriously and are not willing to use it. I mean, if you go back over that history, like early, the very people who are now identified as so-called radical feminists, that Kathleen Barry in her book on female sexual slavery she had a full chapter. Her first chapter was on the family, right? So, all of which is to say that we need to start thinking in serious ways, right? And including in ways that go back historically, but thinking about families now, right? Thinking about where we find ourselves now, about institutions, social structures, how they interlap, how they've transformed, and how we might be able to further transform them in the future. So, big picture, right?
Well, thank you both for joining us, and I'll put the link to the feminist and scholar
and feminist, yeah.
Scholar and feminist online.
We haven't been online for 50 years. That's.
I was wondering. That's pretty advanced.
We have been online for more than 20 years, so that part is that part. We're very proud of that part as well as of the conference in February. So yes, thank you. Please make the connection. And we have an issue in the journal on neoliberalism as well. That's really from the start of this project, so 2013, I think. Which has some videos in it and the like, but that would also address some of these issues.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. This has been very helpful.
This episode of Breaking Culture Live will be available on the YouTube channel, so please share it with your colleagues and let us know if you have ideas for future episodes or invitees by emailing us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com. As I said at the top of the show, we won't have a program for the next 2 Wednesdays, but we will be back on Wednesday, January 7th, to speak with AAUP President Todd Wolfson about the state of U.S. academia and academic freedom, and of course, what we can all do about it. So in the meantime, I hope everybody gets a holiday, some time to rest and reflect, the freedom to be lazy, and that you all have a happy new year. So we'll see you in 2026. Again, I'm Sean Andrews. Please check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com.